What's up guys, it's DoubleZug. So in Mists of Pandaria Classic, a lot of people are going to be excited to play the new spec, the Monk. And the good thing is that post changes, all three specs are looking pretty good, including Mistweaver. Mistweaver is going to be pretty desirable in both 10 and 25 man raid, bringing incredible damage, single target, and AoE. Very respectable throughput, super comfortable mana. Its only real weakness is just a lack of cooldowns. It's similarly strong in 5-mans and challenge modes, as well as being quite powerful in PvP. The playstyle is going to be pretty unique if you've never played Monk before, even if you've played it on retail. The MoP version of the class is a little bit different. It's a unique combination of melee, hot playstyle, ramp healing. It's very active and high APM. Your performance is going to depend a lot on like high uptime, high activity. It's very high damage and pretty good throughput now post changes. And while it does have like a higher skill floor than some of the other options here, the basic play pattern isn't that difficult. You can still do great damage and solid healing without like a master's degree in Thunder Focus D timings. So if you're like scared off by the fact that people are saying it's like the hardest healer, I wouldn't pay too much attention to that. It's definitely worth at least trying out if you enjoy healing and you've never played Monk before. The playstyle and healing profile is also decently flexible. There's a lot of different options in terms of talents and playstyles, and you don't lose too much for playing a suboptimal combination that you just might find more fun or engaging, which is a nice upside. Alright, so before we go through all the spells, I want to just very quickly go over the major features of the spec. So as a healer spec, it does have a mana bar. This is going to be your primary resource, where your secondary resource is going to be chi. So you can see here as I press some of my buttons that will generate chi, I get all the way up to 4. This is basically like a combo point type system. However, your spenders are not going to like use all your available combo points or a set amount up to 3 like Holy Paladin. They have a specific cost. So if you don't have enough to press the button, it just won't happen. And if you have more, it won't like consume all your chi to do more healing or damage. Our core gameplay loop is using our mana to generate chi and using our chi to either do damage with our damaging abilities, which will also generate smart healing, or do healing with our 2 healing chi spenders, one of which is AoE and one of which is single target, kind of similar to Holy Paladin. As we spend this chi, we're going to get stacks of something called Mana Tea. This Mana Tea will offset the high base mana cost of our spells by allowing us to consume it to restore 5% of our mana per stack. Alright, so let's go over some of the basic like passives that the spec gets. First of all, for becoming a healer, we get access to our healing stance. Previously, there was some stuff with stance dancing between this and energy stance. However, now you basically just always want to be in this, as all the stance dancing stuff has either been fixed or patched. This gives you 20% more healing and replaces your energy with mana. Causes our spirit to give us hit and expertise. This is going to be very important for our melee abilities and our spells like Crackling Jade Lightning. It also gives us 50% increased haste from items, which you might think is really insane. However, haste is like a really bad stat for us, which I'll talk about later. It also gives us attack power equal to 200% of our spell power, and also prevents us from gaining attack power from other sources. So this means that despite the fact that we're going to be doing a lot of melee damaging stuff, we won't want to be wearing like melee agility stuff because we can't get attack power from those sources anymore. The most important part of this stance, however, is the very last part, which says, in addition, you also gain Eminence, causing you to heal the lowest health nearby target within 20 yards, or an amount equal to 42% of non-auto attack damage you deal. And you can see if I do something like cast a Crackling Jade Lightning, this is going to tick some damage on the enemy, and I'm going to be healed every tick for 43% of that. So this is very similar to Atonement. The main major differences here are 2. One is that it has a 20-yard range instead of a 40-yard range. The other major thing here is that this is not reduced at all if it bounces to us. So where a priest, if they end up healing themselves with Atonement, it's reduced by 50%, which is like pretty huge, right? We don't really care. We can just heal ourselves with this just fine, and it's not reduced at all, which is really nice. So weaker than Atonement in terms of ranged, but stronger in its ability to heal our player character. The next thing I'll talk about here is our Summon Jade Serpent statue. This is kind of like a passive thing. It's something you kind of just want to keep up all the time. It has a 40-yard range and a 30-second CD, and we can place it down anywhere. It'll just summon this little snake guy, and the reason I want to talk about this here is because it interacts with Eminence, and it causes basically all of our Eminence to be doubled around the statue. So we generate Eminence around ourselves, and the statue will also generate the exact same amount of Eminence around it 20 yards. So you can see now if I press my Crackling Jade Lightning, instead of 1 tick of healing, I'm now getting 2 ticks of healing. and you can see they're for exactly the same amount. You can see it also does scale with critical strikes, but it cannot itself crit, so you can't get a double crit scaling here. So this means that keeping our statue up and keeping it in the right position, because again, it only has 20-yard range on this smart heal, is going to be very important. The statue will last for 15 minutes, so it shouldn't really ever drop, but the cooldown being 30 seconds means that you want to be very careful about where you position the statue. The other thing this statue does is copy our like sort of filler heal, but we'll talk about that later when we talk about spells. Our next passive is Brewing Manatee. So as I said before, this is something you're going to be stacking up as you spend chi, but how does this actually work? Well, for each 4 chi we consume, you get 1 stack of this, and every time you gain a stack, you have a chance equal to your crit chance to double the stacks you get. So this means that your expected value on a manatee is going to be like 1 plus your crit chance. So if you have a 30% crit, you're going to get on average 1.3 stacks of this every time you generate a stack. And you can get up to 20 stacks of this. And you can see here I generated a couple of stacks, and when I sit it, default, you're going to drink all the stacks. It takes 0.5 seconds per stack to drink. So with 20 stacks, it's going to take you 10 seconds. And each stack will generate 5% of your maximum mana, which will scale with like mana gem and some other stuff we'll talk about later. This is a very key passive to our mana management as well as our crit scaling. Next we have Dematerialize. This is mostly a PvP thing, but it is actually incredibly powerful in PvP. Basically, when you're stunned, you become immune to like most damage for 2.5 seconds on a 10-second cooldown. So this won't like purge debuffs or dots or hots or anything, but it will just cause everything to miss you for 2.5 seconds. Very strong in PvP. Not really useful in PvE though. Next we have Mana Meditation. Again, Spirit is just the default mana regen stat for all healers now. Our Mastery, Gift of the Serpent, is kind of an interesting and complicated one. It gives us a % chance per point of mastery whenever we heal to summon a healing sphere nearby an injured ally for 30 seconds. Allies who walk through the sphere will be healed for a certain amount based on your spell power. And if the sphere expires before anyone walks over it, it will smart heal someone within 6 yards for 50% of the effect. This is kind of an interesting mechanic, and you might think upon looking at this at first glance that it's going to be very overpowered with stuff like hots or any kind of spell that ticks very frequently, because, you know, if you're getting a huge number of ticks, every tick has, you know, a 13% chance to spawn one of these spears at my current mastery level. That's going to generate a huge number of spears. While that would be true, this has a hidden coefficient for each spell. So spells that have a lot of hits are going to have a lower chance to proc this than the tooltip, whereas something like our flash heal is going to have like, you know, exactly the tooltip because it's just 1 hit for, you know, a cast. And the way that those coefficients work out in Mists of Pandaria means our mastery is not a great stat for healing. Next we have Muscle Memory. This is a ability that just makes it so that if we use our jab, which is kind of like our Sinister Strike, our like basic combo point generating ability, it's just going to generate 1 chi. And it costs a quite significant amount of mana. This makes it so that whenever we use a damaging attack after this, it will do significantly more damage as well as restoring some of the mana that we spend on jab. The reason this exists is to make jab more mana efficient for doing damage than for healing, and to prevent us from doing things like spamming jab to generate chi, to then use that chi on healing abilities. Next we have Swift Reflexes. This is just like going to do a little bit of damage when we parry. Not super relevant for PvE, but having this high of a chance to parry in PvP against like melee stuff is actually kind of cool. Teachings in the Monastery. This is a long one, kind of complicated. This is whenever we're in our healing stance, we're going to get a buff to all of our damaging abilities, which will make them better at healing as well. The first thing here is CJL. This is our little lightning ability here. In healing stance, this is just going to do 25% more damage. For the rest of these, we'll talk about them when we go through our spells, but they basically just make our spells a little bit better at healing and doing damage. Next, we have Tiger Strikes. You can see I just procced it here. This is an 8% chance on auto attack to increase our attack speed significantly and also double our auto attack. So you can see here every auto attack is doubling, as well as my attack speed being increased. So kind of a flurry type effect there. And lastly, we have Way of the Monk. This is going to change based on what weapon type we have. So Monk is designed to work with one-handers or two-handers. And Mistweaver cannot dual wield like the other specs, but you can still use like your 1 spell power weapon plus an offhand, and that versus 2-hand, the auto attack damage and the strike damage should even out to about the same. What this passive does is increases our auto attack damage with one-handers by 70% and our two-handed weapon speed by 40%. Alright, so those are our passives. Now I'm going to go through these spells one by one. I'm going to start with the healing stuff and then go on to the damage stuff a little bit later. First of all, we don't have the 3 heal structure that was like standard in Cataclysm of heal, greater heal, and flash heal. Instead, we have this interaction between Soothing Mists, Surging Mists, and Enveloping Mists. Kind of replaces it, but in a way that's not exactly 1-to-1. So first of all, Soothing Mist, this is our sort of like heal type ability that's supposed to be low throughput but very mana efficient. What this does is it's a base like 7-second channel, and every second it's going to heal for a small amount, and every tick costs mana, so you don't pay the upfront cost for this. As you channel it, you can see like your mana bar will just tick down as each tick goes off. It also ticks the instant you cast it, which is quite nice. Like, you don't have to wait for the first second for a heal to go off. The other effect this has is that, you know, it has a 30% chance per tick to generate 1 chi. So you can see if I spend some chi and just keep channeling it, my chi is going to go up. The last interaction this has is with our Jade Serpent statue. So you can see if I channel on this guy, the statue will start channeling on me, but for like a 50% reduced amount. The statue will cast Soothing Mists on an injured ally within 40 yards whenever you use Soothing Mists. It doesn't automatically go to your target, it will just pick an injured target within 40 yards. The Soothing Mists that the statue casts will not generate chi, but it's still just like an extra 50% on the healing. So this spell is very, very efficient. You can see it's like 52 HPM up here. This is including the extra healing you get from the chi if you spend it on Chi Spender. Just the spell itself, though, is still quite efficient. The healing per cast time is like pretty low, but, you know, not too terrible. It's much better than a lot of the other specs like heal type button. Definitely castable, and if you're at range and you can't do your melee damaging stuff and you don't want to cast CJL, this is actually quite nice. The other thing that this does that's significant is its interaction with Surging Mists as well as Enveloping Mists. So let's just start talking about Surging Mists here. This is our flash heal type effect. It has like the same 1.5 base cast time, similar casting cost of 23,000 mana, and does just like a significant chunk of healing to a single target. The other thing this does do is generate 1 chi. So this is going to reduce the mana cost slightly here, right? Because if we spend that 1 chi, we're going to get mana tea. So the actual casting cost of Surging Mist is going to depend on your critical strike as well as like your mana pool, and it ends up being a little bit less than 23,000. Like with phase 1 crit, it's going to be about 18,000 mana cost, so it's actually like a little bit cheaper than it looks. Alright, so how does this interact with Soothing Mists? Well, if you cast Soothing Mists on a target and then you press Surging Mists, it will just instantly cast and not interrupt your Soothing Mists channel. So kind of an interesting thing there. If, you know, if the tank's very low, you can Soom the tank instantly and then press Surging Mists. And, you know, because Surging Mist has a cast time, the casting Soothing Mists on the tank and then spamming Surging is going to be like faster and more healing overall. When it comes to efficiency, Surging Mist is much, much more mana efficient than something like Flash Heal for like Holy Priest or Discipline Priest. Again, the reason for this is that it generates that chi. It takes a little bit off the mana costs off the top, as well as that chi being very valuable if you use it to press some of our chi healing buttons. And the healing per cast time is like pretty high as well, at like 150k in phase 1, so it's not terrible to press this button. The real problem with this button is that it's going to interrupt our like melee swing timer and it just doesn't do damage. So we're usually not going to be spamming this, but if you do have to, it's a pretty good spot heal. Alright, so next let's talk about our third single target heal. So this is Enveloping Mists. This is our first Chi Spender. This has a 2-second base cast and it costs 3 Chi, so almost our full Chi bar. And what this does is heals the target for a huge amount over 6 seconds, and this is like a hasted hot, so it can get ticks. And it also increases the target's healing from Soothing Mists by 30%. And very similarly to Surging Mists, what this will do is, if you are channeling Soothing Mists on a target, and you press this button, you can see I just enveloped there, it will not have a cast time. So in combination with Surging Mists and Soothing Mists, you can very quickly, like, say we're doing damage to the boss, and then the tank starts dropping, we can instantly swap and start dumping Enveloping Mists and Surging Mists into the tank and do some very effective spot emergency healing. And the fact that this juices up our Soothing Mists by 30% is, you know, decently significant as well. So all those abilities in combination make our sort of snap single target healing very powerful. The one problem with Enveloping Mists is that you can't like double cast it on one target. You can see if I have one hot up and I cast another one, it's not going to put 2 hots on, it's just going to refresh the original one. That means that, you know, once you have this up, you don't want to like be spamming it on the same target. While Enveloping Mist does do a very significant amount of healing per chi, it was buffed in the changes. It's still much worse than Uplift, which is our like AoE Chi Spender ability, and decently close to things like Kick and Palm, which is our damaging ability. So outside of environments where you're going to be putting this on a tank and it's like not going to be overhealing super significantly, or if you use the Glyph of Uplift, you're not going to be spamming this, but in the situations where it doesn't overheal at all and it's like very effective, it is still quite powerful. Alright, so before we talk about Uplift, we have to talk about Renewing Mists. This is our hot effect, and unlike Rejuve and Renew, this has a cooldown, so you cannot spam this, but it has an interesting interaction here where every cast of this will put out a Renewing Mist, and that Renewing Mist will have 3 charges, and as this ticks down, these charges will spread out across the raid. By default, this will jump to the closest injured person within 20 yards, and this will happen again up to 2 times. The duration of the HUD is 18 seconds, which will change slightly with your haste rating, and it also generates 1 chi when you cast it. Alright, so if I cast this on this Torn here, you can see that when I cast it, it's going to have 3 charges here, and then on the first tick, it's going to split and go to me. I'm going to get 2 charges, and then when it first ticks on me, it's going to split and go to this other NPC over here. When it splits, it doesn't inherit the duration of the previous HOT, it just goes back up to 18, so you always get the full duration on every charge. So total for every cast of this spell, we'll get 3 HOTs. This is going to be very important for Uplift, which we'll talk about next. It also generates a chi, which is super valuable, so this is like a very, very mana efficient spell. You can see Renewing Mist is like almost 40 HPM, very, very, very strong, and also because you get 3 of those long HOTs per cast, you can see its HPCT is very high, up here at like 320k, so just a very, very high HPS and HPM spell. Plus, this will also allow you to use Uplift, which we'll talk about here. So Uplift is our final healing chi spender. This costs 2 chi, so a little bit less than EM. And what this will do is heal every single target with a Renewing Mists active on them for a flat amount, and this doesn't like get reduced beyond targets, it's just totally uncapped. So you can see here, if I put Rem back up on this Torn, it's going to jump to me and then jump to this other NPC. Now I have 3 Rems out, so if I Uplift, it's going to heal all 3 of us for, you know, 33k or whatever the amount is based on my spell power. So this is going to just scale up linearly with the amount of Rems you have out. And so this makes it even more important that you consistently cast Renewing Mists on cooldown. One of the most important things by far for our healing is going to be pressing this button as close to exactly on cooldown as possible. The reason we want to do this is so that we have like the maximum average number of players who have Rem on them at all times. And so you can see like every cast is going to last about 18 seconds. You can get this a little bit longer if you have the right haste break points, because when you gain a new tick, this will be extended by like half the duration of a single tick. But, you know, basically it's 18 seconds. So if you cast them on cooldown, you're going to have these periods where you have an overlap, where you have 2 casts of Rem out. So you're going to have 6 of these HOTs out on the raid. You're going to cast an additional Rem. And by the time this like ticks and splits once, you're going to have this overlap where you have basically 3 Rems out on the raid. In these windows, you're going to have much higher value on your Uplift because there's going to be a lot more targets with your HOT. And also this is going to interact very positively with Thunder Focus T, which allows us to reset the duration on all of our Rems. And this is what gives us our like ramp profile, where we want to have all of our Rems out on the raid. Again, pushing this on cooldown, very important. And then we're going to reset them all, continue to cast Rems, so that we can have, you know, 12, 14, 15 Rems out on the whole raid for a few seconds, where we can absolutely blast healing with Uplift. So again, when it comes to Renewing Mist, the absolute most important thing is to just press this as close to exactly on cooldown as possible, even delaying, like, you know, if you're on the boss using your filler, like jab, Tiger Palm, and Rem's about to come off cooldown, you can delay a jab or a Tiger Palm to get this exactly on cooldown, and that will usually be an HPS increase, despite being a slight damage loss. The last ability I want to talk about here is Expel Harm. So this is an interesting one. It's a 15-second cooldown, very cheap at 7,500 mana. And what this will do is heal loss for a pretty significant amount. It's like almost as much as a Surging Mists, but obviously way, way less mana. Plus this will generate a chi, so the mana cost is reduced even further by that. I think its mana cost is something like, only costs about 3,000 mana with phase 1 crit levels. So very, very, very cheap spell here. It will also deal damage equal to 50% of the amount healed, but this doesn't work on overhealing. So you can see here I'm on 100% HP. If I press it on myself by this target dummy, it will not do any damage. Whereas if I swap my gear off to drop some HP, now if I press it, it will do some damage. You can see there it did about 17k. This is a very, very mana efficient ability. The problem with this is that where previously before the changes, we wanted to cast this on cooldown just because you know, it was so mana efficient. You can see it's like almost 100k HPM if you include the chi. So very, very mana efficient. The problem now is that Jab and Tiger Palm is so mana efficient and does so much damage, especially compared to this, that you really don't ever want to be pressing this for the most part. Unless, you know, you're at range of the boss and you're taking damage, then it can be totally fine to just press this, like, you know, you're moving and you want to do a little bit of healing on yourself very efficiently while generating a chi. This can be worth pressing, but again, with those fist weaving changes, it's just much lower on our priority list. You don't really want to be pressing this over a Jab and a Tiger Palm. The last healing button to talk about here is Healing Sphere. This is a very strange button. It costs 6,000 mana, and what this does is you can see it's a ground targeted reticle, and it will just spawn a Healing Sphere. And if you run over the Healing Sphere, you'll absorb it. The cool thing about this is that it has a 0.5 second GCD in its instant cast, and you can use like an @player or @cursor macro to instantly put these underneath yourself. You can see if I just keep this up underneath my player and spam click it, I'm going to very, very quickly go to 100% HP. And the whole time I was never casting, so I couldn't like be kicked or anything like that. And it does also proc our mastery, you can see there. So this is actually like decently mana efficient. It doesn't generate chi though, so it's not quite as efficient as something like a Surging Mist. But 14 HPM is still like pretty decent, right? And the healing per cast time is very high. This is mostly for PvP, right? Because if you're running around and you don't want to get kicked, you can just like instantly Healing Sphere yourself or Healing Sphere your allies with an @cursor. But for PvE, it can sometimes be useful, similar to like Expel Harm. If you're at range of the boss or you need to just very, very quickly heal yourself up, you can use an @player macro for this to just instantly juice yourself up. So a very corner case spell here. If you don't like want to sweat, you can kind of just ignore this and not even put it on your bars. But there are some circumstances where this will be correct to use, mostly as a self-heal in PvE. If you look at the healing per cast time, it's only very slightly higher than Surging Mist, and being so much less efficient, I wouldn't really use this for tank healing. If you want to tank heal, I would definitely just, you know, prioritize Soothing Mists and Surging Mists and EM spam on the tank. It's just going to do way more healing, a lot more mana efficiently. Healing Spheres also does seem to like reset your swing timer. So you can see here, if I keep spamming it, I will never melee. So, you know, again, as a tank heal, if you're in melee, you aren't going to be getting like melee value out of this. It still resets your swing timer. So again, I would just always prioritize Soothing Mist, Surging Mist spam versus Healing Spheres for tank healing. Alright, so those are all of our healing buttons. Now let's talk about our damaging buttons. Let's start out here with Crackling Jade Lightning. This, previous to the changes, was actually like our best damage button by a decent margin, but it got a little bit of a nerf, having its damage increase from our passive Teachings of the Monastery reduced from 100% to 25%. With the buffs to Eminence Healing, though, this was like basically a slight buff to its healing, but a significant nerf to its damage. What this does is it's basically identical to Soothing Mist. It has the same like channeling duration and tick time, still has a chance to proc chi at 30%, but instead of doing healing to the target, it just does damage to the target and does proc Eminence. So this button is actually a very efficient heal. It's still like 30 HPM, so significantly worse than Soothing Mists, but it's also generating quite a significant amount of damage on the boss. And also all of its healing is smart healing rather than like the single target healing from Soothing Mists plus the statue. So CJL is still a very good option if you're forced to be at range of the boss or if you just don't want to play melee playstyle. The one thing about its chi generation is I don't think it has the same bad luck protection mechanism as Soothing Mist, so you'll have a little bit less consistent chi generation, but it's still quite powerful. Also, if you look at like estimated HPS versus DPS for something like, you know, a Zhuan build, a fist weaving playstyle versus fully filling with Crackling Jade Lightning, our HPS is actually going to be quite similar, only like, you know, 2,000-3,000 HPS increase for fist weaving. Whereas, you know, you're going to be doing 63k DPS with fist weaving versus 46k DPS. So you're losing, you know, 15-16k DPS. But your HPS actually isn't that much worse. So if you are forced to be at range for most of the fight, Crackling Jade Lightning as a filler is actually like a very good medium where you're still contributing significant single target damage to the boss while not sacrificing too much HPS. So this spell is like deceptively quite strong. All right, now let's talk about our melee abilities. So first of all, Jab. This is, again, just our basic sort of like Sinister Strike button. It does a very small amount of damage itself, and you can see its mana cost is very high, like 18,000 mana. However, with all of the other mechanics that interact with this, the mana cost of this jab will be effectively reduced very, very, very significantly, especially as we get higher and higher levels of crit. It does generate 1 chi, which is 1 chi's worth of mana tea. It also procs muscle memory, so if we use this to cast a Tiger Palm or a Blackout Kick, we'll get 4% mana back. So that's 12,000 mana. You can see here if I Tiger Palm, I'm going to get 12k mana. So that means that the cost of jab goes from 18,000 to actually just 6,000. And if you do use this to Tiger Palm, you'll generate a stack of Vital Mists, which is 1/5 of a chi and 20% off the cost of a Flash Heal. With all these modifiers stacked up together, the cost of jab plus Tiger Palm is actually like very, very close to 0 mana in phase 1 crit. And so as we scale up our gear, and if we take things like Ascension, which will increase our mana tea generation, we can very quickly get to the point where the filler of spamming jab into Tiger Palm will actually generate mana rather than costing mana if we spend all of our Vital Mist procs and we drink all of our mana tea. So while the base ability of jab is very, very weak with like 18,000 mana and not doing any significant damage or healing, in combination with all these modifiers, when we stack them all up, it becomes incredibly, incredibly efficient. You can see here in phase 1 crit without Ascension running Chi Brew, the mana cost of jab plus muscle memory plus Vital Mists into Tiger Palm is actually only 143 mana. So we're very, very close to being mana neutral and even mana positive on this ability. And even the base mana cost is actually really something more like 13,000 because again, that chi you generate will generate some mana tea stack. So even if you want to do things like jab, jab, uplift, the mana efficiency there won't be too terrible, and it will sometimes be correct to jab without muscle memory, but by default we will want to be utilizing muscle memory to make the mana cost of this spell lower. Alright, so that's jab. Again, just kind of an enabler for our other buttons. It itself does very, very, very low healing. Alright, next let's talk about Tiger Palm. This is going to be our bread and butter filler on single target. It's incredibly, incredibly mana efficient and does quite significant damage and healing. It only costs 1 chi, so you can just jab into Tiger Palm as a loop, repeating jab into Tiger Palm, and sustain your chi. It does a quite significant amount of single target damage, and it also is boosted by both Teachings in the Monastery, which increases its damage by 100%, as well as Muscle Memory, which increases its damage by an additional 150% if you use it with a jab. So you never want a Tiger Palm just like naked without a jab previous to it. It will also generate a 20-second buff that gives us 30% armor penetration. This is a very significant damage increase, and you should always keep this up. However, the fact that Tiger Palm is such an effective filler means this should just always be up anyways. But in like cleave situations where maybe you're using your AoE buttons, you're spending your chi on mostly Blackout Kick, you still want to keep this armor penetration buff up 100% of the time because it's a significant damage increase on any mob that has armor, which is every mob. If we look at Tiger Palm's healing per chi, it's actually quite high. It's quite similar to Enveloping Mists, and it's about 60% as much healing as an Uplift on average, so it's actually very, very efficient. The problem is, like, in order to do it, you have to jab, so your healing per cast time is going to be quite low. It's down here with, like, Soothing Mist and Expel Harm, and, you know, CGL even is a little bit higher healing per cast time. But the mana efficiency, you can see here, the mana efficiency of this sequence of jab plus Tiger Palm, if you use all those Vital Mist procs, is like 1.2k HPM in phase 1 BIS, so it's like more mana efficient than Revival. This filler is just incredibly, incredibly mana efficient, and again, you can get to gear levels where this literally generates positive mana, which is absolutely incredible. And so even just for healing, this would be very, very efficient as a filler. But it also has the upside of doing a huge amount of single target damage. It does more damage than Crackling Shade Lightning, and of course it doesn't interrupt our auto attack, so we get the benefit of having an auto attack running for the entire time that we're using this filler. So it just has a lot of upside and really no downside. The only downside is just that it's not that high HPS. Alright, so our final damaging filler is Blackout Kick. This costs 2 chi, so double the amount of Tiger Palm. And it still does interact with muscle memory, whereby it will get amplified by 150% if we jab previous to it, or if we proc Spinning Crane Kick and AoE. On a single target, the spell only does about 20% more damage than Tiger Palm, so on single target, this is not worth like spamming as a filler, unless you really want to spend your excess chi on damage rather than pooling it for something like Uplift or EM. The real benefit of this ability is the buff that it provides you. So if I use Blackout Kick, you'll see I'll gain a 30-second buff. What this does is cause our auto attack damage to also proc Eminence at the same value, and it also does propagate off of our statue as well, so we get the same value from our auto attacks as we get from our special attacks. This is very well worth keeping up. It's hugely valuable, and you want to be keeping this up 100% of the time, no matter what, as long as you have the ability to be in melee range of the boss at all. So every 30 seconds at least, you want to be spending one of your excess chi to do a blackout kick over a tiger palm. Blackout kick's AoE scaling comes from Teachings of the Monastery, which says blackout kick hits 4 additional targets for 50% damage. So that's 100% damage from the main target, and if you hit 4 targets, you're doing 200% more. So you're tripling your damage on this ability. This is very, very powerful in multiple targets. You can see if I jab, blackout kick here, the range is quite significant. If I stand exactly on this target dummy, it's hitting this one all the way over here. If I hit the middle one, you can see I'm going to hit both of these. So the radius on this effect is quite wide, and it scales very, very favorably. You can see as I scale up and targets hit, my damage is going up quite a lot, as well as my healing per chi. At like 5 targets, this actually does more healing per chi than an average uplift. And even at like 4, it's quite comparable to Uplift. Plus the addition of the tremendous amount of damage this will deal means that in like 3+ target environments, you're highly incentivized to spend all your excess chi on Blackout Kick rather than Uplift. Unless you're inside of like a Thunder Focus T window where your Uplift is going to be hitting a lot more targets than the average hit. Alright, so those are all of our melee abilities. Now the very last thing to talk about here before we go into our talent section is Spinning Crane Kick. This is a very odd ability. It's a channeled ability which does interrupt our swing timer, which is kind of a downside. What this will do is it will do some AoE damage. You can see if I go into range, it's going to do some ticking damage. This will tick 4 times no matter how much haste you have. Haste will just reduce the cast time rather than like give you extra ticks on this. So it interacts haste like not necessarily a positive way, but reducing that cast time is like nice, right? It lets us get back to our other buttons and our auto attack faster. We can move around while we channel it, but our move speed is going to be reduced slightly. Teachings of the Monastery will turn Spinning Crane Kick into our sort of like AoE healing filler, similar to Healing Rain and Sanctuary and stuff like that. It will make this smart heal maximum 6 targets within the range, and it has the same number of healing ticks as it has damage ticks, so you'll get 4 ticks out of this every cast. And as long as you hit more than 3 friendly targets with this, it will generate a chi. As well as if you hit more than 3 enemy targets with this, it will also generate a chi. So you can see here, if I'm between these training dummies, close enough to hit all 3, and I Spinning Crane Kick, I will be getting a chi. The other thing this will do is if you hit enemy targets, meaningfully not friendly targets, so if you're in the raid stack and you're spamming this for healing, you will still be getting chi, but you will not be proccing muscle memory. But if you hit 3 enemy targets, you will proc muscle memory. So this will save you the cost of like having to press a jab for some of your blackout kicks or your tiger palms. So how good is this spell? For healing, it actually is quite efficient. It's around the sort of like POH efficiency level of 24 HPM. So this is pretty strong. The problem here is that you get a little bit of loss from interrupting your auto attack, which is going to reduce like the effective HPM and HPS of this spell because you're going to lose that auto attack, both damage and smart healing. Also on single target, the damage of Spinning Crane Kick is quite weak. However, because we're so mana unlimited in Mists of Pandaria with these new changes, dumping a lot of our mana on Spinning Crane Kick as we get more and more gear is actually going to increase our HPS quite significantly. So if you look at something like a Zwen build that does fist weaving but also includes some Spinning Crane Kick as a filler, it's going to be doing like, 219k HPS versus the same build when Fist Weave without that Spinning Crane Kick filler is only going to be doing about 200k. So you're getting like 10% HPS, and if we look down here at like the DPS, if we compare Zwen Fist Weaving to Zwen Fist Weaving with Spinning Crane Kick, we're only losing like 7k HPS. So what this means is that Spinning Crane Kick, even on single target fights, is a powerful ability to increase our like rot AoE healing in exchange for a small amount of DPS. And so while you definitely don't want to be like spamming this constantly all the time no matter what, in parts of the fight, even on single target where there's a little bit higher rot healing, you can sacrifice some jab Tiger Palm for Spinning Crane Kick in order to just ratchet your HPS up a little bit at a slight DPS loss. And as soon as you can hit that 3 enemy targets breakpoint where you're generating both the chi and muscle memory, Spinning Crane Kick is going to become very, very efficient, both healing and DPS. Alright, so those are our spells. Now let's look through our cooldowns really quickly here. So unfortunately we don't have that many cooldowns baseline. Our main AoE cooldown is Revival. This is a 3-minute, it costs 23k mana, so kind of expensive, but what this does is heals all party and raid members within 100 yards for a pretty high amount, like obviously based on spell power, right? And it also clears them of any harmful magical, poison, and disease effects. So this is like pretty insane single global heal. kind of a lay on hands on like the whole raid. The 100-yard range means, you know, basically infinite. It's going to hit everybody in the raid, really no matter what. The fact that this does all of its healing in a single global means it's going to be much more important to like time it properly relative to something like a Healing Tide Totem, where if you press a Healing Tide Totem early, it doesn't really matter because it's still going to be up for the duration of the damage mechanic, whereas like if you press a Revival early, you can, you know, do a huge amount of overhealing and have it be much less effective at covering a damage instance. However, the fact that it does all of its healing up front means it's a very, very effective like emergency button, which can instantly bail you out of a bad situation. So that's our only raid cooldown. For our single target cooldown, we have Life Cocoon. This is a 2-minute and it does require healing stance. This does not put a damage reduction on the target like most other healers' externals. What it will do instead is put a giant absorb shield, and it will also have the effect of increasing all periodic healing taken by 50%. So it's both like a giant power word shield plus a GS only for HOTS. And meaningfully, this 50% amp will increase things like if we have a REM on the target, that's going to get boosted. It's going to boost our Soothing Mists, as well as boosting our Enveloping Mist, which is our most powerful single target cooldown. Plus our Enveloping Mist is 30% on Soothing Mist, so you get some kind of stacking modifiers there. So if you do put this like on a tank or on a player that's taking a huge dot or something like that, while the absorb is up protecting their health pool, you're going to be able to top that health pool very, very quickly because of that healing amplification. This is also really insane for things like Sulong, where you can stack it with GS and amplify all your other healers' HOTS on a single target to like just insane levels, but that's obviously very situational. So overall, this is not like a super strong external compared to something like Iron Bark or Pain Suppression because it has no DR, but for like single very large hits, this can be very effective. So those are our 2 cooldowns. We also though have a sort of effective raid cooldown in Thunder Focus T. So as I mentioned earlier, this is something that will allow us to reset the duration on our Renewing Mists. It also can boost a Surging Mist, but in PvE content, you're basically never going to be using it for that. So how does this work? So if I put my Rem out on the Tauren again, I'm going to let it spread, generate some chi here. You can see now it's spread to all 3 targets. If I press Thunder Focus T, meaningfully this does cost 1 chi. If I press that, you can see my Renewing Mist is now getting down to 6 seconds. If I uplift with that Thunder Focus T out, it will be reset to its full duration. So the way we're going to be utilizing this is, you can see here, this is like a cast pattern of Rems. So, you know, I'm going to be casting my Rems, they're going to be stacking up. As soon as we hit that overlap where I have my 2 Rems out, I cast my 3rd Rem, I let it jump to the point where I just barely have a half a second left on all my Rems. I'm going to Thunder Focus T uplift, reset all these, so you can see all 3 of these casts are going to last another 18 seconds. And then, you know, obviously 8 seconds later, I can cast another Rem. And so for the whole duration of this Thunder Focus T window, I'm going to have much higher average hits on uplift, plus the extra healing and coverage on the raid of having all these extra HOTS out. So Thunder Focus T has like a dual effect there where it's going to increase your HOT healing and your coverage, as well as also juicing up your uplifts. And then, of course, at the very end of this window where I'm going to have like all 4 of these casts, I'm going to have a couple of seconds where I have 5 casts of Rem out. And in this window, you know, your uplifts are obviously going to be just insane. Again, casting your Rems exactly on cooldown so you have access to this overlap as much as possible to Thunder Focus T reset is very important, as well as timing this Thunder Focus T cast properly. So if you have like a damage instance somewhere in here, you want to time your Thunder Focus T reset to be at the last triple overlap before that damage instance. So ideally, you know, you'd have your damage instance start somewhere here, you'd reset at this point, and then you'd get, you know, your maximum coverage to cover this damage instance. However, on fights where there's rot and there aren't like very big windows of burst damage, you can kind of just cast your Thunder Focus T on cooldown, and it will both amp your like overall Rem healing as well as your overall uplift healing. And again, this is sort of a second raid cooldown on a 45-second CD, because inside of this window we have, you know, more than average Rems out on the raid. And if we do things like, you know, pool, chi brew, or even potentially use Glyph of uplift, which we'll talk about later in the Glyph section, we can dump a huge amount of AoE healing inside of this reset window. The last ability we have here is another very odd one, which is a 3-minute cooldown called Zen Meditation. What this does is reduces all damage we take by 90%. Which is huge, right? That's like, you know, dispersion, so we can use this to soak stuff. And it also has this weird effect of redirects up to 5 harmful spells cast against party and raid members within 30 yards to you. And it says being the victim of a melee attack will break your meditation, so this won't really affect us as healers. We're not going to be tanking the boss. So kind of a mix here. On some fights, this is going to be a personal defensive cooldown, and on other fights, this is going to be a semi-raid cooldown with that redirection. When it comes to defensive, we have Fort Brew baseline, which is a 3-minute shield wall. That also just increases our health by 20%, so a nice defensive here. For mobility, we have 2 baseline options. We have roll, which will just move us a short distance in the direction that we're moving, meaningfully not the direction you're facing. So if I face forward but move right, roll will move me right instead of forward. Our last mobility baseline option is Transcendence. This is basically just Warlock Portal. If you place a little version of yourself down, you can then use your transfer to swap yourself in the other position. So this is going to be quite useful on some fights. Again, kind of just similar to Warlock Portal for the most part. Alright, so those are our cooldowns. I'm going to go through the talents really quickly. Our 15 row is all mobility stuff. The first option, Celerity, reduces the cooldown of our roll by 5 seconds, as well as also giving us 1 extra charge. Also for HPS, if you do end up taking Chi Torpedo, this is a quite significant HPS increase. You get 25 full hits on your Chi Torpedo, which is your best case scenario. This talent is actually going to be like almost a 9% healing increase, so very powerful. Tiger's Lust is a freedom/70% sprint on a 30-second CD. You can cast this on yourself or allies. By default, I would just take this because of that flexibility of being able to cast it on allies. Our last option is Momentum. What this does is give us a 10-second speed buff after you roll. So you can see if I roll here, I get this Momentum buff. A nice thing about this is it stacks up to 2. So if I wait for this almost to fall off, I can roll again, where I'll get 2 stacks now, so 50% MS for 10 seconds. Overall, like, these are all pretty equal. I would just default to taking Tiger's Lust. Our 30 row is our first throughput row. It gives us access to 3 abilities, all of which do some healing and some damage. Chi Wave is a 15-second CD, and it will just, you know, bounce around doing 4 damage hits and 4 healing hits. So this doesn't like scale up with AoE, it just does the same amount of damage no matter how many targets there are. The healing will smart heal, and this does do a significant amount of both damage and healing. Alright, next we have Zen Sphere. This is a little bit of a complicated, weird one here. So what this does is it will put a hot on the target. It has a 10-second cooldown. You can only have 2 of these out at a time. The hot lasts 16 seconds, and weirdly does not get extra ticks from haste. It just always does the same amount of ticks. And you can see that the hot will heal you and also do some damage to a single target near you. This is a 10-yard radius, so if you're in melee, this will always hit the boss. And then when it ends, it's going to explode, and the explosion does damage in 10 yards as well as healing in 10 yards. The healing of this is sort of like diminishes beyond 6 in a weird way. I think it's square root capped or something. The explosion will also be triggered if the target that has the hot on it goes below 35% health, or if it's like dispelled or whatever. So if you put this on the tank and the tank gets hit to below 35%, you'll instantly get the pop, which is kind of nice. However, the problem with rolling this on the tank is that you want to get maximum value out of the AoE healing. So you kind of want to put it in someone who's like in the stack, and the tank is usually not like that close to the stack. Chi Burst is pretty simple. It's basically just Divine Star that doesn't come back. It's a 30-second CD, and when you cast it, it's going to shoot out and do uncapped AoE healing and uncapped AoE damage. It has kind of a little bit of a wonky hitbox sometimes, but generically this is very, very powerful if the rig is stacked up, especially in 25-man, because it's uncapped. Chi Wave is a pretty solid HPS and DPS, and the fact that it smart heals is nice, but it doesn't scale up with target counts in both enemies or friendlies, so no matter how many players are in the raid or how many enemies there are out, it's just going to do the same amount of damage and healing. It's more GCD efficient than Zen Sphere, but less GCD efficient than Chi Burst, and this actually matters because we are so GCD capped with the mana changes giving us so much mana. Zen Sphere is nice because its damage is going to scale up with target counts in both like friendlies and enemies, with the explosion doing AoE damage and healing. It's very global intensive though, compared to especially something like Chi Burst, which is, you know, 1/3 the globals to actually keep this up. This is also going to be really good in dungeons because you can like pre-hot this and load it up between packs, and it's going to do solid AoE healing and good damage at like 5 targets, friendlies and enemies. It will do less damage and healing with the hot if it pops below the damage threshold, but usually if it pops below the damage threshold, that's good because it's going to be healing somebody who's in danger. And the fact that the damage range is only 10 yards from the target means it's going to be annoying to use this on ranged players in a raid if they're too far from the boss or the ads, so you're going to prioritize this on melee players for the most part. Lastly, we have Chi Burst. This is a 30-second cooldown, so it's a lot more GCD efficient. It also is super uncapped and does like a little bit more healing than something like a Zen Sphere explosion, so this is going to scale a lot better at higher targets. However, on single target, this is actually the worst DPS of all 3 options, because just getting 1 hit out of this every 30 seconds is just not that much damage compared to Zen Sphere or Chi Wave. And Chi Wave is actually the highest DPS on a single target versus Zen Sphere, which is kind of close, but again, the higher global cost of this is going to make it a little bit worse than something like Chi Wave. Burst does start to outperform Sphere at like 6 friendly targets hit, and the very high end at like 25, it's like double the healing of a Zen Sphere, which is pretty powerful. If you want to mess around with these talents and compare them, this chart here will show you the estimated HPS and DPS of each option based on enemies hit. So if you imagine like one friendly hit and one enemy hit, Wave is by far the best. Whereas if you go to something like 6, we can see Zen Sphere is actually ahead, whereas, Wave is still actually a little bit better on DPS. And if we go to something like, 5 enemy targets, now all of a sudden Sphere and Burst are going to be doing more DPS than Wave. And if we go to something like 25 friendlies hit, we can see now Chi Burst is like way ahead of the other two options, doing, like 80,000 HPS just by itself, which is incredible. With Zen Sphere still keeping up and doing slightly more DPS, and Chi Wave still doing the most DPS, again, because on single target, Chi Wave is just the highest DPS by a decent margin. So in a 25-man environment, I think you should generically take Chi Burst. However, in a 10-man or in 5-mans, both Wave and Sphere both have like decent usability in my opinion. However, Zen Sphere is going to be by far the most finicky and annoying one to use properly. Alright, so for 45, we have another throughput relevant row. This is going to be our Chi generation and mana row. Power Strikes is going to give us an extra Chi every 20 seconds by giving our Jab, Soothing Mist, Spinning Crane Kick, basically all of our Chi generators the chance to generate an extra Chi. Ascension is going to increase our maximum Chi by 1, which doesn't really matter for Mistweaver. It kind of helps us maybe pool a little bit more for Thunder Focus T window with Uplift, but not hugely relevant. We should never be overcapping Chi. It's going to increase our maximum mana by 15%. This is pretty significant for giving us a lot more mana from our Mana Tea. And then energy regen, it doesn't matter. Our last option here is Chi Brew. This is the only active option here. So if you want to do passive playstyle, I'd recommend just taking Ascension. But this is going to be significantly better than the other two options. What this does is every 45 seconds we get a charge of this, and every charge is going to give us 2 Chi and 2 Mana Tea stacks. So if we pull 2 charges of this, we can, Thunder Focus Tea reset and instantly do 2 uplifts just with Chi Brew, which is pretty powerful burst healing, as well as the fact that this gives us 2 Mana Tea and 2 Chi means this is actually going to give us more mana overall than Ascension. So you can see in our phase 1 biz here, if I check Chi Brew, I'm capping out at like 248 HPS, and if I check Ascension, it's only like 242. So Chi Brew is like by far better. In lower gear, these get a little bit closer together, but Chi Brew is just by far better at basically every gear level, so I would by default take this. However, if you do want to just play a little bit more relaxed, not have to manage your Chi Brew, taking Ascension isn't too bad, and Power Strikes is just by far the worst option, significantly behind both Ascension and Chi Brew. Also, the slight quality of life of having 5 maximum Chi will let you do some kind of interesting stuff, like, you can pool 5 Chi and have enough Chi for a Thunder Focus Tea and then 2 uplifts. Our 60 row is all like PvP crowd control stuff. Ring of Peace is kind of cool. What this will do is like put a little ring around your target that will silence and disarm enemies in the radius. Charging Oxwave will charge everyone in 30 yards in front of you for 3 seconds, and Leg Sweep is a 45-second CD, 5-second AoE stun, which is just very powerful. By default, I would just take Leg Sweep. It's going to be really nice for like trash, anything that's stunnable, anything like 5-mans or whatever, but sometimes Ring of Peace can be useful. Our 75 row is going to be Defensiveness. The first option, Healing Elixirs, is just a nice passive healing option. Every 18 seconds you gain this effect. It heals you for 15% of your health the next time a damaging attack would bring you below 35%, or if you drink a brew or tea. So this is just going to happen in the background and give you some nice passive healing. Dampen Harm is our next option here. This is a 1.5 minute CD. This will reduce the next 3 attacks on you that do more than 20% of your health by 50%. So really good for physical hits or for just big hits in general. Diffuse Magic is the last option. This is a kind of a cool one for PvP especially. It reduces all spell damage you take by 90%. So we have another 90% DR, including, Zen Med. We have 2 of these, very powerful. This is also 1.5 minute CD like Dampen, so pretty short here. We can do a lot of soaking with this, and it lasts for 6 seconds. So this is only magic damage. So if we want big physical DR, we can take Dampen, magic DR, we can take Diffuse. And then if we're lazy and we just want to do passive option, we can take Healing Elixirs. Also, because Healing Elixirs will show up on logs as healing, you can take this if you want to like cheese your HPS. Our 90 row is a very important throughput row and has 3 abilities that are all very, very powerful. The first option is Rushing Jade Wind. This will completely replace our spinning crane kick and cost the same amount of mana, but it has a pretty powerful effect. What this will do is it just costs 1 GCD, and meaningfully this no longer like channels, it doesn't reduce your move speed at all, and it doesn't impact your auto attack timer, so you can still auto attack as well as do things like jab and, you know, cast any abilities while this is up. So that in itself is very powerful. It also lasts considerably longer and does 9 ticks of both damage and healing instead of 4. And it will also still give you a chi if it hits more than 3 friendlies, and a muscle memory if it hits more than 3 enemies. This follows very similar rules to before when I talked about spinning crane kick, where taking Rushing Jade Wind is going to give you a lot higher like average rot HPS in exchange for a small reduction in the amount of DPS you do. However, again, because this Rushing Jade Wind does not cancel your auto attack or take up your GCDs, it actually is going to reduce your damage significantly less than spamming spinning crane kick. So if we look at something like a Rushing Jade Wind Fist Weave versus a Joanne Fist Weave, with spinning crane kick, we're going to be gaining a very significant amount of extra HPS from those Rushing Jade Winds, and we're actually only going to be losing about half as much damage. And that's in single target. Again, as we go up in terms of average enemies hit to like that 3+ level, this will start doing really, really good damage as well. Part of the reason why this is like pretty good in terms of HPS gain as well as not like a huge DPS loss is because when we're full using Fistweave filler with just jab and Tiger Palm most of the time, we actually end up with like a huge amount of extra mana that we can't really dump super effectively. Because, you know, spamming something like Surging Mists or Spinning Crane Kick again is going to be a damage loss. Whereas with Rushing Jade Wind, we can pretty easily spend all of our excess mana while still having very good uptime on Jab and Tiger Palm. So this talent giving us the ability to like pretty effectively dump all that excess mana gives it a little bit of an advantage over the other two options here, which don't cost any mana. It's really competing against Glyph of Uplift as a mana dump, which we'll talk about a little bit later. Our next option is Invoke Gwen, the White Tiger. This is a 3-minute cooldown and will summon a little cat friend, which is, you know, he's pretty cool looking. You can see he's like an astral beast looking cat model. This lasts 45 seconds, so it actually has a pretty high uptime. And what it does is it will both melee the enemy that you're attacking, as well as doing an AoE like crackling lightning effect that will hit up to 3 nearby enemies. So this does scale up with target count up to 3. Both its melee and lightning will both proc Eminence, so this is actually a pretty powerful healing cooldown as well as damage cooldown, especially if you can get up to those like 2 to 3 target counts where your lightning is cleaving. This ability also gains a tremendous amount of value in terms of its damage, because we can pop it on pull with like pre-pot, all of our procs lining up, Bloodlust, all that stuff, to just get a huge amount of damage as well as cover any healing that's done in the first 45 seconds of the fight. It's by far our highest DPS option on single target. You'll mostly be using this as a DPS CD, however, if you can line this up without losing cast inside the fight to align with the damage mechanic, it actually is a pretty powerful healing cooldown as well. So I kind of lowballed like the DPS estimate on here. I didn't include like pre-pot and lust and all that stuff, which you will be getting, but even with the full lowball, this is going to be about like 12% more damage than even the highest damage second option. And you're only losing like maybe 8-9% healing versus like the full blast healing Rushing Jade Wind playstyle. So generally speaking, for the average fight, it's going to be very worth it to run Gwen just for that damage increase. Last here we have a kind of a strange one with Chi Torpedo. Generally speaking, if you do take this, again, you'll want to be pairing it with Celerity for the reduced cooldown as well as the increased charges. Chi Torpedo will deal damage and healing to anything that you pass through when you roll, and this also by default travels a little bit further than roll. So you can see here, if I Chi Torpedo through all these training dummies, I'm going to do damage to all the dummies as well as healing myself. This, similar to Chi Burst, is completely uncapped in the amount of damage and healing that it does. And so similar to Chi Burst, this is going to scale very, very well as targets go up, especially in 25-man. So you can see at 25 targets hit, just Chi Torpedo alone plus Celerity is going to be doing like 75k HPS in Phase 1 BIS. Also with Celerity, you have the ability to pool 3 charges of this all together, so you can do actually pretty significant burst healing on the raid by just Chi Torpedoing through the raid stack 3 times. So this gives us another like effective 45-second burst window, which is really nice. If there's very consistent burst damage on the raid stack, you can do things like, you know, Chi Burst 1 damage instance, Thunder Focus T the next damage instance, triple Chi Torpedo the one after that, and then just sort of alternate between these. So for certain damage patterns, Chi Torpedo will be pretty effective. This is going to start to compete with Rushing Jade Wind spam at, you know, like 10 to 15 targets hit, so I wouldn't really run this in 10-man most of the time, but in 25-man, there actually are probably some opportunities where Chi Torpedo can be the best. option. Again, because this costs no mana, it's also viable to use this in combination with Uplift Glyph. This does have the downside that you can no longer use your rolls for mobility if you want to pull them for healing. The other thing is that, you know, if you're using your rolls through the raid, you can sometimes get yourself into bad positions. However, there's a couple of ways you can mitigate this. So if you jump and press torpedo in the same instant, while you're jumping, the torpedo won't be moving forward. So you can effectively torpedo and only move like maybe 10 yards. The other thing you can do is if you hold forward and backwards. So right now I'm holding forward and back pedal at the same time. If you do that and then torpedo, you'll torpedo in place. So if you're on the raid stack while you're doing that, you should get most of the raid stack hit by torpedo. It's kind of like retail where, you know, you always have your demon hunters fell rushing off the cliff. Don't do that to yourself with chi torpedo. Either use the jump tech or the torpedo in place tech to prevent those goofy deaths. Alright, so we finally made it through all the spells and talents. Now we're going to talk over our priority list really quickly here. So first of all, just be in healer stance. This is super obvious, right? All the stance dancing stuff that previously existed has been either fixed or patched or whatever, so we always want to be in Stance of the Wise Serpent. Our next highest priority is just to use our cooldowns. Obviously, you want to use the maximum amount of these possible while still being effective and not like sniping your other healers' cooldowns. Revival, very important, very high HPS and HPM button. Thunder Focus T. So for the most part, you want to be timing this around damage windows, as I talked about before, but again, on rot fights, you do just kind of want to use this on cooldown. Missing a cast of it in the fight is going to be a pretty significant HPS loss. We obviously also want to get max uses out of Joanne and Chi Cocoon. Definitely keep an eye out for opportunities to save people's lives with Chi Cocoon. It's a very powerful like emergency spot heal. Alright, so first of all, it's very, very important that we keep our statue up and also in range of the raid. Since we only have a 20-yard range on these abilities, it can be useful to, since we're going to be in melee, you obviously are going to heal the melee with yourself, so you can keep your statue out in the range stack to spread your healing out a little bit. Eminence is going to be a huge amount of our healing, so losing 50% of it if you misplace your statue is just massive, massive loss. After that, our highest priority is going to be renewing Mist on cooldown. Again, very important to press this as close to on cooldown as possible. Even delaying other abilities to push it perfectly on cooldown is going to be very valuable. After that, we want to maintain both our Blackout Kick buff and our Palm buff. If we're ever going to be in melee range, we obviously want to keep, you know, Serpent Zeal as well as its armor penetration buff up as much as possible. Although really the only thing you are going to have to consciously be doing is Serpent Zeal. Next we have Chi Burst. I put this a little bit higher than the other two options on the talent row because it's just global for global, much more impactful, especially on a full stacked raid. So sending this on big damage burst is going to be pretty powerful. Next I have Torpedo, again kind of similar to Chi Burst, uncapped heal on the raid stack. Going to be high priority in like any kind of high damage environment. Next we have Wave and Zen Sphere. These are going to be a little bit lower priority than Chi Burst, but still very, very efficient. Damage and healing global for global. After that we want to spend our excess Chi. So of course we never want to be overcapping, and in the course of doing our filler rotation of just Jab and Tiger Palm, some of our excess Chi we generate through Rem casts as well as Vital Mist stacks will be going to maintain Blackout Kick, but we'll slowly be gaining Chi from casting these abilities, and obviously we don't want to overcap, so any excess Chi we generate should just be sent into Uplift. Our next priority is going to be Rushing Jade Wind / Spinning Crane Kick. Depending on how our mana looks, you won't have 100% uptime on Rushing Jade Wind if you take that talent. However, even in like Phase 1 Bis, we should have like about 70% uptime on Rushing Jade Wind, so you can press it almost on cooldown. When it comes to Spinning Crane Kick, again, as I said before in the spell section, you want to use this if you're willing to sacrifice a little bit of single target damage for more AoE healing, so this is kind of a situational thing here. Next, we want to always be spending our Vital Mist procs. One thing to mention about Vital Mist procs is, of course, if you let it stack all the way up to 5, as we see here, casting the Surging Mist will not cancel your auto attack, which is quite nice. However, if you do need to, don't be afraid to send this early. You know, maybe if you have 3 or 4 stacks of Vital Mist, you can always send this on someone who needs spot healing. Obviously, somebody dying is worse than you losing a little bit of uptime on your auto attack. So that's our priority for CDs. Now to talk about spot healing here, I would say your number one option for spot healing is going to be your Vital Mists. So if someone needs healing badly enough for us to be willing to stop our auto attack and our Tiger Palm Jab rotation, the most effective, like highest HPS instant way of doing that is to swap with Zoom and then pop a Surging Mist or a EM if we have the Chi. This is actually faster than just casting Surging Mists on them, assuming we don't have haste to be like 1 second GCD capped, because the Soothing Mists takes a 1 second GCD to put up, and then instantly after that 1 second, we can blast a Surging Mist. So if we take the Soothing Mist option, we're getting 2 ticks of Soothing Mists in 1 second, plus we're getting a Surging Mist, whereas if we just cast Surging Mist as a spot heal, all we're getting is 1 Surging Mist in the 1.4, 1.3, whatever your haste is cast time of Surging Mist. So again, if we are having to swap off, it's definitely worth to Soom before you Surging Mist. Plus, Sooming on the target gives us the option to EM them if they do need like a lot more focused healing. This makes just like a naked Surging Mist without a Vital Mist proc a pretty bad spot heal. When it comes to filler, our single target filler is very simple. It's just going to be jab, Tiger Palm spam forever, and then of course spending your Vital Mist procs for Chi as well as healing. For Cleave, things get a little bit more complicated here because Blackout Kick is going to cost 2 Chi instead of 1, so we can't just alternate between Spinning Crane Kick and Blackout Kick, and we want to be weaving rems in there. So what we're going to be doing is rem, Spinning Crane Kick, into a Blackout Kick, into a jab, into a Spinning Crane Kick, into a Blackout Kick, into a rem, and then we're just going to repeat that process. When we take Rushing Jade Wind, our Cleave is going to look a little bit different. Obviously, we're still going to rem on cooldown. We're going to Rushing Jade Wind into Blackout Kick, into jab, jab, Blackout Kick, into jab, Rushing Jade Wind, rem, Blackout Kick, into jab, Blackout Kick, jab, Rushing Jade Wind, Blackout Kick, jab, rem, Blackout Kick, jab, Rushing Jade Wind, Blackout Kick. So with Rushing Jade Wind, it kind of complicates the rotation a little bit. Also, if you do really care about your rems, you can always delay your Cleave a little bit to get those rems perfectly on cooldown. And doing that will always, again, give you better windows for TFT resets. So there's a little bit of a choice there between full uptime on Cleave and getting your rems out exactly on cooldown, which is just going to depend fight by fight on whether or not you want that HPS and ramp over more damage. So that's our basic Cleave rotation. If we are at range of the boss and we cannot use our melee abilities, for damage we're just going to be spamming Crackling Jade Lightning as a filler. And if we want to do a little bit more healing and be very mana efficient, we can instead Soothing Mists. If you do choose to go for a more healing focused ranged playstyle while you're pressing Soothing Mists quite significantly, don't be afraid to swap targets aggressively and use your Surging Mists aggressively. This spell is so mana efficient that if you don't press Surging Mists while you're Sooming, you will end the fight with like way overcapped mana, which is just a massive healing loss. So again, don't be afraid to, if you are Sooming quite significantly, to use your Surging Mist to both spot heal and generate Chi for, you know, uplifts and EMs. Alright, so that's our rotation. Now I'm going to really quickly go over Glyphs. There's not that many important Glyphs for us, honestly. There's really only one that's worth going into in detail. Afterlife is kind of cool for leveling. Detox is like a PvP thing. Enduring Healing Spheres, this is kind of interesting. This will make our Mastery Spheres last 3 minutes longer, which will give players more time to run over them before they like expire and smart heal. However, if nobody ever runs over it and it was within 6 yards of a player, this is like a loss in healing, so kind of a weird one. I think generically you probably just run it though. Next we have Fort Brew. This is like mostly a tank thing, doesn't really matter too much for us. Fortuitous Sphere, when we fall below 25% health, we get a free healing sphere every 30 seconds. Kind of a cool one. Life Cocoon, this doesn't matter for PvE, but kind of nice for PvP. Glyph of Manatee is kind of an interesting one. What this does is makes our Manatee no longer like force us to sit down to drink. It's a 10-second cooldown that consumes 2 stacks. And the big upside of this is you can see here I'm like auto-attacking the dummy, and if I press my Manatee button now, I get 2 stacks, so 30k mana, and it doesn't pause my auto-attack. So generally speaking, if you use this perfectly, it's going to be a slight damage increase over sitting down, unless the boss has downtime where the boss is immune, or something like that, in which case drinking your Manatee is going to be better. The downside of this is that if you get behind on using this, you can be stuck like without the ability to consume your Manatee stacks quickly enough. Glyph of Renewing Mist, this is kind of an interesting one. This forces our Renewing Mist to go to the furthest target in 40 yards rather than the nearest in 20 yards. This glyph will allow us to force all of our hot and uplift healing into the ranged to not compete with our eminence healing, as well as having the qualitative benefit of forcing our healing to go where usually other healers' healing isn't. So things like Healing Rain, ground effect, stuff like that. Divine Star usually is not going to hit these players that are super far away. So forcing our rem onto them is overall good for the raid and for our own HPS as well. Spinning Crane Kick makes us move fast while we're kicking, not hugely beneficial. Surging Mist, this is a nice one if you're super lazy. It will just make your Surging Mist auto-target, and you can also force this to single target again by just channeling Zoom. Touch of Death will give us a little bit of damage on like ads or something, which is maybe interesting. Transcendence and Zedman both give us a little bit of mobility, sometimes useful. Targeted Expulsion, this is like the real killer glyph here. What this does is, post changes, this will cause our uplift to now cost mana instead of chi. So before we go into that, I just want to say like the default setup is going to be something like Rem plus maybe Enduring Sphere, and then whatever you want, honestly, like maybe Mana Tea or something. None of these glyphs are like super high impact, so it really doesn't matter what you go here beyond your choice of whether to take targeted expulsion or not. So with Glyph of Uplift, there's a couple of things to talk about here. First of all, the 30k mana cost is pretty high, and this is not reduced by like spending chi anymore, so it's just flat 30k. However, as I talked about before, in a lot of these play patterns, if you aren't taking Rushing Jade Wind, you're ending the fight with just crazy amounts of excess mana unless you do something really dumb like spam Spinning Crane Kick or spam Surging Mists, which is a pretty significant damage loss. And so because we have so much excess mana, even in low gear like Phase 1 Bis, the ability to dump this mana into Uplift is actually like pretty interesting in my view. And given perfect play, I think it's going to end up being the highest HPS option if you don't take a really good mana dump like Rushing Jade Wind. I wouldn't play this glyph with Rushing Jade Wind. The major downside to playing this glyph is that now you have to use all of your extra chi either on EM, which requires you to like either cast EM on a target or Zoom that target before you EM them, which, you know, is a lot of lost auto attack time, or you can spend your extra chi just on Blackout Kick. So I think this glyph actually gets significantly better in cleave environments where you want to spend your chi on Blackout Kick anyways, and it also is made better by the fact that we did get our EM buff, so EM is now actually like pretty good healing per chi. So if you do want to use like the kind of wonkier playstyle of whenever you get to like that 4 chi level with your Vital Mists and with your Rem casts, you just like, you know, assume the tank and put an EM on them, and then go back to damaging. You won't lose too much damage that way. So if we look at the HPM of Glyph Uplift, it's actually pretty low on the average hits case. It's lower than, for example, like Jab Jab Uplift. Just a raw double jab into Uplift is actually slightly more HPM. However, the main difference here is that Jab Jab Uplift is going to require 3 globals. And so, you know, the HPS of Glyph Uplift is going to be triple Jab Jab Uplift. And this is going to be really useful because we can just spam this every single global inside of a tight window. If we do use this specifically inside of a Thunder Focus T reset, so let's say, for example, I have, you know, my Rems out, I'm casting my Rems, I have my little Rem window where I Thunder Focus T and Uplift to reset, and then, you know, I'm waiting 10 seconds, I get my next Rem out, I get my third one out, now I have maximum uplifts out on the raid. I can now spam Uplift every single global inside that window to just do incredible burst healing, and then afterwards I'm going to Mana Tea back up and go back to my, you know, Jab Tiger Palm filler. So I think the best play pattern for this glyph usage, especially early with lower gear, you're going to be using very efficient Jab TP filler. You're going to be pooling huge amounts of mana, and you're really only going to be uplifting either in emergency situations or inside of a TFT window. You're going to be dumping all your extra mana to do big burst healing. So this playstyle is probably going to end up having lower overall like average rot healing, but significantly higher burst HPS. And so if you look at my estimated HPS, the Mistweaver Zhuan with the Uplift glyph that only uses Uplift inside of TFT windows is actually significantly ahead of just Zhuan Fist Weaving. And you only lose like a very slight amount of DPS versus Fistweave from losing those globals you're going to be spending on Uplift. However, this is assuming that you like perfectly use all your extra chi on EM. If you don't use all your extra chi on EM, this healing will go down quite significantly. If you're using it on Blackout Kick, however, if you do use it on Blackout Kick, your damage is going to go up a little bit. So I think your optimal damage setup is going to be the Uplift glyph plus using your extra chi on Blackout Kick. And the like mid-optimal HPS setup, if you aren't using Rushing Jade Wind, is going to be to run Zhuan or Chi Torpedo, Uplift Glyph plus using your excess Chi on EM. However, that playstyle is going to be like way more finicky and harder to min-max and like kind of annoying to play with EM, and not like a hugely significant HPS increase versus just running like a full Fistweave Zhuan setup and occasionally pressing Spinning Crane Kick when you need that extra healing. So those are our glyphs. Now I'm going to go through stat weights really quickly here. So all these stat weights are based on Phase 1 loose Bis gear. These will change a little bit based on your gear level and whatever stats you have. If you want to calculate them, you can just use the sheet. The rankings of the stats will not really vary at all, honestly. First of all, intellect is by far our best stat. It's both the best for HPS, being more than double crit, and this gear level also being the best for DPS by a considerable amount as well. Next we have crit. Crit is by far our best secondary stat. It's like 13 times better than haste and like 3 times better than mastery. And it's also better than both of those stats for damage as well. The reason for this is that both haste and mastery are just very poor stats for HPS overall, and critical strike has that very powerful extra scaling with manatee stacks, as well as it just being like an okay stat for our healing, right? Just a chance to double your healing is pretty good, and contributing significantly to our damage, making all of our damage spells also have a higher chance to crit. So just an overall very, very powerful stat. Unfortunately, haste and mastery and spirit are all pretty bad. This means our scaling is going to be a little bit worse late game versus specs that have very good scaling with every single stat, like something like a Resto Shaman, which wants pretty much everything pretty equally. We really don't want to have any haste on our gear, and ideally as little mastery and spirit on our gear as possible. When I estimated mastery, I estimated 25% of our healing spheres timing out in smart healing, but if we remove this and we just look at 100% value from all of our mastery spheres, this will go up slightly. This spirit weight is with Glyph of Uplift. Without Glyph of Uplift, if you're playing Rushing Jade Wind, it will be a little bit lower than this. And if you're playing a like full Fistweave playstyle with Zhuen or G-Torpedo, spirit will have effectively 0 value, unless of course you're doing something like spamming Surging Mist with your extra mana, in which case you'll get a slight amount of value out of spirit. However, we do want spirit to our hit and expertise cap breakpoints anyways. And so generally speaking, you're going to be prioritizing crit and then spirit and then mastery, and then haste is dead last. The only effect haste has on our healing and damage between rem breakpoints is just on our auto attack swings, and that's like very, very minor. You can see it's like 0.263 HPS per point of haste, whereas crit is 3.4. However, if we are forced to have enough haste on our gear, it can be correct to just go for those rem breakpoints. The first one we'll just guaranteed to get because it's only 150 haste, so even if you have 0 on your gear, just putting 1 haste gem in is enough to make this breakpoint. The second one's about like 3150. So generally speaking, in most gear that forces you to get some haste, I would go for this second breakpoint. But of course, this just depends on what your gear looks like. Also, if you are playing like a full Fistweave playstyle with Zhuen or G-Torpedo, spirit is actually like basically worthless. So I would just go haste as priority over spirit in those situations. However, spirit is useful just to give you extra room to spot heal with, especially like very early in pre-bis, you will want to have some amount of spirit. Alright, so next I want to talk about gems. First of all, we want to take crit meta. Very early on, if you take mana meta and pair it with Ascension, you can get pretty good gains out of this, but as soon as you get any amount of crit, I would just take the crit meta. For our gems, for red and yellow, we want int and int crit. For blue sockets, we want int spirit. However, most blue socket bonuses are not going to be worth it, given how low value spirit is, unless of course you're below that spirit breakpoint for like expertise and hit, which is about 5k. So yeah, pretty simple, basically just gem int and gem int crit. For professions, it's kind of the same story as for every healer. We want NG for nitro boots, as well as our gloves being nice for like using with Zhuen or with a thunder focus T reset. Our second profession can really be anything that's a main stat profession, except tailoring is going to be kind of nice for like our big damage and openers in Lust with Zhuen and stuff like that. And leatherworking, of course, being nice for the drums of speed. Also, alchemy gives us access to alchemist stone, which is going to be a really strong pre-bis option. Even though it has mastery on it, we can just reforge the mastery to crit. And the big intellect proc is again going to be huge for our damage on pull, as well as intellect just being a great stat overall. And the extra mana on the alch stone being somewhat useful if we are playing that glyph playstyle or Rushing Jade Wind. Skinning is actually decent for us if you want to make gold. I would never go herb. For racials, for alliance, we really only have 2 options. Human, dwarf, Draenei, and night elf are all like pretty bad, but not so much worse that if you like them just for the appearance, you can't take them. Gnome is a kind of an interesting one here because the 5% mana pool will scale with manatee. This is a significant amount of HPS, but the problem is here that like the fist weaving playstyle that you're generally going to be defaulting to is so not mana limited that this extra mana does not really matter and doesn't give you any DPS. And so outside of like corner case environments where maybe you're playing Glyph of Uplift or you're playing Rushing Jade Wind and you actually get to use that extra mana for something that does healing or damage, Gnome is just going to be far worse than the best option for Alliance, which is Pandaren. Pandaren gives you 300 intellect, which is big HPS and big DPS. So for Alliance, I would just definitely go Pandaren. For Horde, we can either go Pandaren, which is still very, very good for Horde, So I think Orc is the best for Windwalker, and it's actually pretty close to Panda in terms of HPS, with your cooldown giving you like 300 average spell power. Torn is like useless. Troll is just worse than Orc, but the 5% damage to beast is kind of cool, and the haste cooldown, like, again, not really useful. We have a 1-second GCD, and so this haste ability is just going to give us like maybe an extra tick on rem during the duration, so pretty useless. Undead is like useless outside of PvP. Blood Elf is kind of just like a worse version of Gnome, where it gives you a little bit of mana, but that mana does not really matter for Mistweaver anymore. So generally speaking, for Alliance, you're going Panda, and for Horde, you're going either Panda or Orc, depending on whether or not you're going to play Windwalker. When it comes to consumables, you just always want Intellect, you want Intellect Food, you want an Intellect Flask. And for potions, I would probably just Potion Intellect. Again, our mana is going to be very, very comfortable if we're Fist Weaving, and Intellect is going to give us like pretty similar HPS overall to a mana potion, plus it's going to give us a bunch of damage. So yeah, I would just default to potting Intellect and try to line up your second Intellect pot with a use of Zhuen if you are using Zhuen. Alright, so to end off here, I'm going to talk very quickly about macros and UI. Firstly, same thing applies to Mistweaver as does to every single healer. You really want to have mouse overs and click casting set up for all your major healing abilities, as well as any kind of weak aura that puts your major cooldowns and your mana bar central to your screen. This is Luxthos, but you can use any kind of weak aura that does the same thing. Using a centralized weak aura like this versus staring at your action bars on the bottom of your screen is just going to make your healing a lot more effective. Secondly, for raid frames, there's actually not too much to track on raid frames for Mistweaver. You can do things like track your Zen Sphere, of course, but the main important thing you want to track on your raid frames is Renewing Mists. You can see here what I have is a color and a duration for Renewing Mist. This is important because the color makes it super obvious who has the hot already, so that when I recast it, I don't overwrite. Because if you overwrite, you're going to be losing like one extra target. So having something on your raid frames that will allow you to quickly see who has and does not have this hot is going to be very, very powerful. Other than that, in terms of macros and stuff, there's really not that much to say. One last thing, though, is that having a weak aura to track whether or not your Serpent statue is down or in the right place is also going to be very, very important, as again, optimizing this statue is going to be a massive amount of our healing. So that's the guide. If you have any questions, you can comment below or ask in my Discord channel. Also, the spreadsheets are posted in the Discord channel, as well as like any other future week or grid profile stuff is also going to be posted in there. Thanks for sitting through my hour-long yap. If you enjoyed it or if you learned anything, like, subscribe. I will be coming out with guides for all the remaining healer specs for MoP. Thanks for watching. See ya.
Swobu, Zug Zug.